Which brings us to the story of Zach. I'm not going to read it to you. If you've grown up in church, you know it by memory. If you haven't grown up in church, you've seen it 1.5 times already on the screen. But how do we approach this story? There is one approach which I would call the Sunday school approach I learned when I was a child. This is a really neat story with lots of really interesting things happening. But I walked away from Sunday school saying, what's going on here? And then when I was a teenager, there was the Aesop Fables version of this story. God loves everybody. The proof of the fact that God loves everybody is that Jesus went and visited this awful person called Zacchaeus, who was a terrible tax collector, a cheat and a liar and a thief, and everybody hated him. And because God loves people like that, we should too. That's the Aesop Fables version of the story of Zacchaeus. And we all know it because we've all heard it. And we may even have taught it to our children. And then there's Luke's version. Luke's version says that Jesus, according to the disciples in verse 1, 19 verse 1, he was just going to pass through town. He was a man on a mission. He was headed to Jerusalem for his crucifixion. He knew what was on the end of the road. It was called death. He knew he was going to be murdered in the eyes of humanity, but from his perspective, he was giving up his life for our salvation. And as he was walking through town, all of the little chatter stuff happening, you know? Don't know how it happened. I've been in places where there were riots happening. You hear the roar from a distance away, and you have a choice to go towards the noise or to stay well away. Zacchaeus heard of all this racket. He knew, he asked what was going on, and he heard that it was Jesus. Now, let's remember, the jungle telegraph was working very well in the first century. If the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Jerusalem knew about the miracles that Jesus was doing up in the Galilee, then certainly someone who was a federal subcontractor, Zacchaeus, the tax collector, would have had the connections throughout the country to have heard stories about Jesus. And he thought, oh, this guy is coming through town. And obviously he was curious. And he wants to see Jesus. And this is the first part of the story that the Sunday school version told but I forgot, and the Aesop's Fable version just totally overlooks. Because Zacchaeus was looking to find out more about this Jesus guy. Now, did Zacchaeus have in his mind, I'm going to go to hear this Jesus guy and have my life changed today? I don't know. The Bible is pleasantly silent on this fact. But we do know that he went looking for Jesus. And he wasn't going to be slowed down. Now, he could have thrown his authority around and said, hey, you know what, I'm the chief tax collector in this town. Let me see Jesus. Let me through, I'm an important man. But he didn't do that. That's the second interesting thing about this story that gets overlooked in the Aesop's Fables version. He he didn't throw his weight around. He didn't act with pride. He stifled his pride, and this grown man climbed up into a tree to see whether he could even see Jesus. But there's also some other things that the story overlooks when we take it from this Aesop's fable perspective. Because what happens is we jump in near the end and we say, oh, Jesus says that this man's saved. But what we miss is this fact. That Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector in town, and that he was very wealthy. According to the Roman poet Cicero, the trades of tax collector and moneylender were the true trades that even in Roman society were despised the most. Lucian, another Roman historian, is said to list tax collectors in with adulterers and snitches. We know that in the time of Jesus, tax collectors collected income tax, crop taxes, highway tax, taxes for offloading your fish from your boat, and about a half dozen more taxes. These guys literally had their hands in everybody's pockets, even without gouging. So he literally had a license to print money. And he used it. This is part of his character, part of what we miss out on when we sort of gloss through the story. So, then Jesus comes into the story. And whether Jesus was actually walking past that tree, or he saw some commotion, went over to see what was going on, or whether the Spirit told him, you've got to go over to that tree because there's someone in there we need to talk to, I don't know. Again, the Bible is pleasantly silent. But Jesus goes to the story. Jesus seeks Zacchaeus out. And this wasn't, hey, Zach, I want to hang out with the prostitutes and the other publicans and drink some wine with you down in the pub. This was, Zach, you and I have to have a conversation, and I want to come to your house. He intentionally sought out Zacchaeus and said, it's time we talked. Let's go to your home. Which blows a hole in the Aesop's Fables version again, because what does it mean? It tells us that in our associating with those who may not come inside the church is not just that we hang out with them, but it's, are we intentional in connecting with them with a purpose? Or is it just trying to show that we're more tolerant than other people? We're more understanding than other people, which is what the Aesop's Fable story tells us. Because Jesus recognized that Zacchaeus wanted something. Now Zacchaeus, he had a choice here. He's up there in the tree. He could have said, I just want to see you. I just want to hear you. He said, no, I'm not coming. He could have said, no, I'm not coming down. But he came down. He took Jesus to his home. And I've often pondered what Zacchaeus' housekeepers and cooks would have thought when Jesus showed up at his house with his little entourage of 12 disciples and whoever else was traveling with him. I mean, this is more than just put another cup of water in the soup and thin it out. This is, we got a whole group of people here. Zacchaeus did that because he wanted to have that conversation with Jesus. there's a huge part of the story that Luke skips over. The only thing he doesn't skip over is that there's people in town are not too happy with Jesus because he's not gone to the places they wanted him to go. He's not had the conversations they wanted him to have, but he's gone to that house to talk to that person. The other thing that Luke doesn't tell us is Luke doesn't tell us exactly what they talked about. What we do know from the story is this. In verse 8, Zacchaeus says, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Whoa. Zacchaeus is openly confessing that he has been a liar and a cheat. He's not only openly confessing that, but he's openly confessing that he's willing to do something about it. He's willing to make a change in his life. Zacchaeus didn't just admit to his sins, he repented of them. He said, "I'm not going to do that anymore." And he drew a line in history and acknowledged that the lifestyle and business practices which had gotten him to this point would no longer do. I have spent part of my summer reading about the Methodists and the Salvation Army. And you know what? In the early days of those movements, when people got right with God, they got right with God and they gave up the old ways. Whether the old ways were drinking or gambling or dance halling or making money off of slavery or anything else, when they got right with God, they got right with God and they gave it up. That's what Zacchaeus is doing. And he does it in a really spectacular way. Imagine someone who you know who makes money in a questionable way, and they do that. This is costly stuff here. This is really costly stuff. But that's probably too far removed, so let's bring this back even closer to home. What Zacchaeus is saying is he's saying the most important thing in my life up until now has been money. He's saying my God has been money. And I'm going to give up my God of money, and this is how I'm going to do it. When we start thinking of it that way, all of a sudden it becomes very accessible. Because it could have been his reputation. It could have been his position in society. It could have been some other set of accomplishments that he would have said, this stuff is not important in comparison to following Jesus. You see, when we take the focus off the action of how much money, when we take the focus off of whether his lifestyle was right or not, and we start looking at his attitude, what it is was the most important thing in his life, then we realize that this is a really profound thing. Because Zacchaeus was basically saying the thing that is most important in life is nothing, because what I really want to do is I want to follow Jesus and I want to honor God in everything. And because I want to honor God, half my money goes to the poor immediately. And if someone has been cheated, I won't just pay them back what I cheated them. I won't even do what the law says and I pay them back double. I'm going to pay them back 4 times what I cheated them. Zacchaeus was willing to become financially bankrupt in order to get out of his moral bankruptcy. But it's more than just moral. He was willing to become financially bankrupt in order to come out of his spiritual bankruptcy. This is the stuff that the Aesop's fable version of story of Zacchaeus never gets anywhere near. And because Zacchaeus was willing to take the gods of his life and sacrifice them for the sake of following Jesus, Jesus says in verse 9, "Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that what was lost." Salvation came. Not because Zacchaeus gave away his money, but because Zacchaeus had an inner change that said, the central reason why I live has got to be God and not money. I got a question for you. I've been laboring with this question all week. I was going to put this question to you at the beginning of the sermon, but I was afraid if I did, that some of you might turn me off before I got to it. What does following Jesus cost you? We like our comfort as Canadians. We like doing things according to tradition. We like our ambitions if we're younger. And those of us who aren't quite so young, we still have ambitions. We like, if we're Canadians, we like keeping the peace, sometimes at all costs. There's a host of attitudes that we have that can get in the way of following Jesus. And the real question is, if we want to move past the Aesop fables version of this story, we have to begin by putting ourselves in Zacchaeus' position, not putting ourselves in the position of Jesus and saying, I'm doing what Jesus did, but to put ourselves in Zacchaeus' position and ask ourselves, what are the attitudes, the comfortable little attitudes that help me to feel safe and secure? What are the ambitions, the comfortable little ambitions I have that give me a sense of purpose, that squeeze God out, that squeeze salvation out of my life? And what am I willing to do about those things so that when I pray, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." I'm not just thinking about the other people over there, but I'm saying, God, your will be done in my life as perfectly as it's done in heaven. Or am I wanting to hang on to those things, those attitudes that let me play it safe spiritually, but actually result in my spiritual bankruptcy because they're more important to me than following Jesus? Well, what would life look like if I did that? Well, sometimes it would mean that rather than playing it safe, I speak up and I talk about Christ and I talk about what Christ means for me. Sometimes it would mean that I would act with compassion towards people. Not because Aesop says it's a good thing, but because God is at work in my heart and God gives in me a compassion and a love for others. Sometimes it means that I will sacrifice my agendas and my ambitions because being with someone who is in need of the comfort of the gospel is more important. If I'm a grandfather, I am one. It means being willing to say that building a relationship with my children and my grandchildren to reinforce the faith in those settings is worth giving up an evening in my garden or preparing some lecture that only 6 people are going to hear and maybe no one's going to remember 2 years from now. But what is God asking of you? What is that comfortable spot in your life where God's become tame and God says, no, I want to move in and I want to get serious with you. And I want to ask you, what are you willing to give up for me? Because what God is saying is, what's mine is yours. You can have my power. You can have my comfort. You can have my life. But it's going to cost you. I paid the cost of your salvation, but it's going to cost you. Because if you want what's mine, you have to give up what's yours so that God can give you what is His. Take a moment for quiet prayer, and then we will conclude with our closing hymn.